Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Bliss, the Adult Services Librarian here at South Burlington Library, and I welcome all of you to our Frederick Douglass reading. Today we are lucky to have Paul Yoon doing moderation, and he's going to make a few remarks to place the speech in context before we start to read. I just wanted everyone to know that we have copies of Brown Girl Dreaming, which was part of the Vermont Reads project for the whole state through Vermont Humanities Council. We have copies available, and anyone can take one if you'd like. I have many more in the back if those run out, so please avail yourself of that. And I'm going to now hand this over to Paul.
Thank you so much, Susan. Good morning again to all of you. My name is Paul, as Susan mentioned. I'm really thankful to have the opportunity to moderate this event this morning. I also have the privilege of serving as the assistant principal just across the parking lot at the Frederick H. Tuttle Middle School, and I'm so excited that our community and this library is hosting an event like this. We also have a very special guest who's joined us today, who's right here on my left. His name is Paul Marcus. He's a very, very close friend and mentor of mine. And I actually wanted to share a quick story to start this morning about Paul and one of our very good friend and mentors, Horace, as well. I was first introduced to this speech and to the life of Frederick Douglass all the way back in the fall of 2002. It took me a little while to learn more about Frederick Douglass, but I had the opportunity to take a class that Horace and Paul were co-teaching at my alma mater, Boston College, titled The History and Development of Racism in the United States of America. And that class quite literally changed my life. It changed the direction of my life, and it helped me really find and really be proud of what I now consider my vocation in life, both to be an educator as well as an anti-racist activist as well. I am so thankful again that Paul is here. He's actually going to help us this morning by talking a little bit about the context in which this speech was delivered all the way back in the mid-19th century. He's going to talk perhaps a little bit also about Frederick Douglass's life. Afterwards, I just want to take a moment to explain how we'll be reading the speech together. So everybody should have a copy in front of them. What we'll do is we'll go through and we'll read kind of each section number by number. Given the size of our group, there should be plenty of opportunity for each of us to read. Some of them are a little bit shorter than others, and I think that, again, given the size of this group, that's okay. What may end up happening is that we'll come all the way back around, and some people will have the opportunity to read two of the sections from this speech. I do also want to briefly acknowledge that this is not the full text of the speech. There are multiple versions that the Vermont Humanities Council provides. There's a short version, which this is. There's a medium version, and then there's a long version. The long version is, I would argue, well worth your time. Just given the kind of context and the space of this event, we thought that the short version would provide us ample kind of topics to discuss afterwards. And at the end, after we've read the speech, we do want to make it optional for people to stay if they can, to continue a conversation. We understand, though, that some people may need to excuse themselves and leave, and that's perfectly understandable as well. Before we begin, and before I turn over the mic to Paul, are there any questions about kind of how we're going to do this event or anything along those lines? Yes.
It says in the beginning, he's in a certain place, this beautiful hall. Where did he first get there? I'll talk about that.
You'll talk about that. Just to answer quickly, it's Rochester, New York. And Paul will talk more about that. Okay. Any additional questions? Okay. All right. Well, again, I'm going to turn it over to Paul here in a moment. Before I do, though, I just want to say that Paul is the former executive director of Community Change. It's a anti-racist nonprofit that was founded in the Boston area by Horace Seldon. He led that organization faithfully for many, many years and is now one of their principal consultants, doing a lot of facilitation and consulting in this space with lots of different organizations, community groups, etc. And he also happens to live here in Vermont with his partner up in the Northeast Kingdom. So welcome, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn the mic over.
Good morning. And I want to welcome you to the second annual Frederick Douglass reading here in South Burlington, which we're very excited about.
And special thanks to Paul and Susan. This is the second year the library's hosted it, and it's really nice. Paul and I haven't seen each other in quite a while, and it's really nice to reconnect in person. So Paul told you a little bit about me. I'll say a little bit about. So I stepped down as executive director of community change after 16 years in 2013, and I had during all of that time I've lived in Vermont and New Hampshire for the last 35 or so years, and so living in the Northeast Kingdom, that trip back and forth to Boston every week got a bit hard, and I decided it was time to stay. It would get harder and harder and harder to leave Vermont, and so this event started at Community Change. We really loved this speech and thought it was a important way to reflect on the 4th of July holiday. And so we began to gather people in our library for a brown bag reading of the speech. We started with the full version, actually, the long version of it. And from that, some of the people who came to that, particularly a man named David Harris, who's the executive director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School, felt we needed to make this a bigger event. And so we gathered a number of groups in Boston and connected with Mass Humanities. And that led to the first Boston event. And now that event's been going on in Boston now for, I think this is the 8th or 10th year, and it's 300 or 400 people show up in the Boston Common for the event. And then we also wanted to make it an event that could be replicated, and so along with us and Mass Humanities developed a resource on their website for anybody who wanted to do an event. When I got back up to Vermont, full-time, I approached Vermont Humanities, and actually I approached them after we began to organize some events across the state. The first year we had 4, St. Johnsbury, Burlington, Montpelier, and Brattleboro. And this year, we've had over 30 events across the state. I think this might be the 32nd event. So we're very, very excited about that. I would just love to hear from you all anything you know about Frederick Douglass. Well, people need the mic to. Yeah. So if anybody.
Well, I'm from Rochester, New York. And I've actually been to Frederick Douglass's grave in Rochester, New York. He's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, along with Susan B. Anthony and her family. And so one of my brother-in-laws died last year, and the service was in a church where the reception was one picture on one end of the wall was Frederick Douglass, and Susan B. Anthony was on the other end. So I feel really happy to be from that kind of background.
Anyone else? Any facts about his life that people know?
As I understand it, he was married to a white woman. Is that true? And if so,
Later in his life.
that must have been very unusual at that time.
It was.
Okay. Is it a story you want to enlarge on?
It was a second marriage, and it was a bit controversial at the time.
Okay.
I think here and there.
I read somewhere that he was in jail for some time, and I'm guessing that was probably because of his anti-slavery documentation.
Well, yeah,
Do you know?
Yeah, and also, I think people are aware that he was born in slavery.
Yeah.
In
Yes.
Maryland, and then escaped and found his way north, originally to New York, and then initially to New York very briefly, and then to Newburyport, Massachusetts, and then I'm trying to think. He had to leave the country at least once to go to England, to Canada, and then to go to Canada, and then to England. I don't remember him being in jail. But don't quote me on that, because I haven't looked at that history in a while.
He escaped from slavery. He wrote an autobiography, which became well known and huge. There's a copy there. He was an abolitionist, of course. He was against slavery, always speaking against it, and a pretty well-known speaker. When Lincoln came in, he tried to persuade Lincoln to let ex-slaves be in the Army, the Union Army, and he wanted the Emancipation Proclamation. I heard a story that he went to a reception, a New Year's reception or something at the White House, and at the door he was turned away, or he said he couldn't go in, but somehow Lincoln got word he was there, and Lincoln came out and brought him in.
Yeah, that's he came to Washington to see Lincoln. This was very early on, and Lincoln had already known about him, and there was a whole bunch of people waiting, sometimes for days, downstairs to see Lincoln. And when Lincoln found out it was him, he had him brought right up. Yeah.
As you said, he was an influential speaker, an influential writer, who, by his very existence, was contradicting the narratives that were being put forth, saying that slaves were not intelligent, that slaves could not do this kind of work. And he also supported the women's rights movement. So, yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, here, thank you.
Well, you mentioned his trip to England, and when he was over there, he talked extensively against slavery. And at that time, the English government was considering an effort to support the Confederacy in their effort in the Civil War, which would have been very important because Confederacy didn't have the mechanical abilities that we had, that type of economy. But because of his influence on the people and the nature of the government in England, the government was afraid to support the Confederacy, and in fact did not.
And there are copies, Vermont Humanities supplied copies actually of the first edition of Douglas's narrative. He rewrote this at least 2 other times, in I think in the 1850s and then just before he died. So please make sure you get a copy. There's a limited number, but I think there may be close to enough for everybody. So as we thought about this event, there were really 2 major goals, and one was to connect to some of the history that we're not taught. I don't know if anybody, James Lowen was at the University of Vermont for a long time, and he wrote a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, and I'd recommend that to anyone. It's a very accessible book. In fact, it used to be a text in our course. And if you recently, in February actually, the president made a quote saying that Frederick Douglass is an example of someone who's done an amazing job and is getting recognized more and more, I notice. So there's a history that we don't know. The second is to have an opportunity to reflect on the meaning of Douglas's words for us today. And I'd like to kind of briefly just touch on those. I want to get to the speech, because that's really the heart of this event is the public reading of this speech. But in the early republic, the 4th of July oration was an important moment of commemoration, celebration, and reaffirmation. Americans came together to pay tributes to the heroes of the revolution, our founding ideals of liberty and freedom. Is that better? So citizens would gather in communities, and there would usually be a prominent statesman, an orator who would typically sing the praises and virtues of America, praising the founding fathers and asking the citizens to live up to our founding ideals. The 4th of July oration was a big deal. Douglass was invited to speak at Corinthian Hall in Rochester on July 5th, 1852, by the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. And I've heard different reasons why it was on the 5th. One was that the 4th was on the Sunday that year. I haven't checked into that. The other was that Douglass didn't want to have anything to do with really celebrating the 4th, but I think it's actually the Sunday version that is true. He delivered the address to an audience of about 500 or 600 people. I've been thinking on my way here, I wanted to call John Stauffer at Harvard to fight, because I've heard mixed feelings about the way this speech was received. And I think, I want to get a definitive answer on that. But at the time he spoke in 1852, there were over 3 million blacks enslaved in the country. By the end of the decade, there would be 4 million. I want to just take a side note on language. I very intentionally use the word enslaved because it's an active. When we talk about somebody being a slave, it doesn't sound like, it sounds like they're a slave and nothing's been done to them. But when we use the term enslaved, it's an active term. Just like now, I don't use the word plantation. I use the term slave labor camp, because a very different meaning there. By 1840, cotton produced by slave labor constituted over 59% of U.S. exports. In 1860, those enslaved were an asset worth much more than all of the country's manufacturing, all of the railroads, and all of the productive capacity of the U.S. combined. Another excellent book I'd recommend is called Complicity, How the North Profited, Promoted, and Prolonged Slavery. And in that book, we learn that, in fact, many of the economic models that we use in investment now come from that time. Enslavement, the system, was the internet of its time. There was major investment. There was insurance. There were companies building the tools of enslavement, ships, shackles. Many of the major, New York as an economic center becomes an economic center because of cotton. I mean, it's how deeply entrenched this system is in the U.S. And it's a system that evolves. We always think of it as stagnant, but it evolves. And in fact, there were studies. If you go to a school of agriculture now, they do studies on how many chickens you can fit into a cage and that sort of how to increase productivity, and that was happening at universities. And so we don't have a sense of the impact and the importance of this system. So I just also want to share that Douglass actually spoke here in Vermont several times, but he spoke in Middlebury in 1843, and Middlebury professor William Bart wrote about recently in the Addison County Independent. And he said, speaking of the event, he says, this was, I think, a quote, in fact, Douglass notes in Life and Times of Frederick Douglass that the town's opposition to their convention was intensely bitter and violent. Middlebury College students had placarded the town calling Douglass an escaped convict from the state prison. One reporter painted the speakers as outside, that might refer to actually time in prison. One reporter painted the speakers as outside evangelicals and immediatists from Massachusetts. He stamped them all as Garrisonian visionaries who were ready to break down the existing institutions of the country under pretense of advancing the sacred cause of freedom to the slave. And then another reporter, after praising Douglass, goes on to say, however, this reporter regretted that Douglass had fallen under the sway of some other class of abolitionists that had encouraged him to brand the whole American nation as a nation of liars, a nation of thieves, a nation of scoundrels. He warned that unless Douglass ceased his indiscriminate and wholesale denunciations of the clergy and the church as an abolitionist, he is shorn of his strength. So at that time, the majority of whites reviled Douglass and the abolitionists. It was a time when racism was when explicit interpersonal racism and bigotry was way more, and although things are shifting a little bit as we're seeing, unfortunately, but was nothing like anything we could imagine. But when we look back at Douglass today, we celebrate him as a hero, a person who was on the right side of history. And likewise, many whites reviled Dr. Martin Luther King. I don't know, many of us here are old enough to remember that. I certainly, not just in the South, I can clearly remember news reports. I can clearly remember hearing comments from my white working class neighbors and relatives. He was viewed as a criminal by the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and in fact, his surveillance was signed off by the president, by two presidents, actually. Yet today we honor him with a national holiday, and we see him as someone who was standing on the right side of history. And I look back on those times, and I hope that I would have stood with Frederick Douglass and with William Lloyd Garrison and the abolitionist movements. I know I stood with Dr. King. I'm old enough to have been there. So the reason I'm saying this is because that the movement for racial and social justice hasn't ended. We're living it right now. And so what David Walker and Mariah Stewart and Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and W.E.B. Du Bois and Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and Dr. King and Malcolm X and James Baldwin and countless other voices were saying was that Black Lives Matter. And yet, when we look at Black Lives Matter and other movements for racial justice today, they're getting the same kind of pushback we've seen in the past. It's a continuation of white people who look like me, denying the lived experiences of people of color. So we hear things like they're too radical, that they're a terrorist group. In fact, they just got a very major peace prize given, I think, from one of the Scandinavian countries. We hear that all lives matter, and that's true. We all acknowledge that, but we know that all lives don't matter until Black Lives Matter. We hear that blue lives matter, and that's true. We hear that racism isn't an issue anymore. It's time to get over it. So the movement for racial and social justice hasn't ended. We're living it. And today, we all, through our thoughts and our actions, have the existential choice to determine the side of history on which we want to stand. We often, and I think Paul will remember this, use a grid in our workshop, and it's four boxes. In the upper left hand, so it says racist, anti-racist, active, passive. So in that first quadrant, it's active racist, and we know that there's a percentage of people in this country who are active, bigoted white supremacists. If we look at the other box on that side, it's passive racist, and I would argue that that's the status quo, right? And then the other box would be active anti-racist, and that's people who are working for change. And finally, that third box would be passive anti-racist, and there's a big X in that box because it doesn't exist. You cannot be a passive. You cannot passively work for racial and social justice in the country. So to close, I'd just like to say that this event provides us with an opportunity to reflect on both this remarkable speech and think of both its historical context and its meaning for us today. We're still deeply involved for the struggle of what Horace Seldon, who Paul alluded to, called the struggle for the soul of our nation, that the nation was founded on this terrible contradiction, that in that contradiction that on one hand all quote-unquote men are created equal, while on the other hand that's clearly not true, is built into the fabric of the nation. And until we honestly face that reality, we can never resolve that contradiction. And I'll end with a quote from James Baldwin in a letter to his nephew. He said, "They," meaning people who look like me, are in effect still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. So it's our hope that as you think about this event, as you think about this, that you'll have this speech in your head and your heart as you reflect on the 4th of July and as you celebrate the holiday moving forward, and that we'll all commit to the action, and there's small or large actions that we can do on an everyday basis to take action for racial justice in our own lives, in our communities, and in the nation. So, thank you.
Thank you, Paul, so much. And I'll just very briefly share that even though it's been 15 years since I took the course, I had the privilege of co-teaching it with Paul for 5 consecutive semesters after spending 3 more semesters with him as an undergraduate TA. But just this morning, I worked with a young 17-year-old who I've been working with for some time on these issues, and we did the grid together. And I challenged him with that thought, thinking about what the implications would be for him to have to choose from this day moving forward whether he would actually be an active or a passive racist or an active anti-racist. So your work and Horace's work is still very much alive and well. So what we're going to do now is we'll transition to actually reading the speech. What I'll do is I'll start with the number 1 section. I'll turn it over to Paul. He'll read the number 2 section, and then we'll keep on going down. I think what we'll do is just go down along kind of in a circle here, and then after Susan finishes, we'll come back this way. So again, most people should have at least 1. I think actually most people will have 2 opportunities to read a section. All right? Okay.
And it's okay to pass.
And it is okay to pass as well, if you feel so inclined. Thank you for that reminder. Would you mind holding this for me, please? All right. I don't exactly know what Frederick Douglass sounded like, but I recently listened to James Earl Jones orate this, and I'm gonna try to get into character here a little bit. So the meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro. Frederick Douglass, July 5th, 1852. Mr. President, friends and fellow citizens, the task before me is one which requires much previous thought and study for its proper performance. The papers and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. This certainly sounds large and out of the common way, for it is true that I've often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who now honor me with their presence. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. That I am here today is to me a matter of astonishment as well as of gratitude.
This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and your political freedom. This, to you, is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. You are, even now, only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon.
Fellow citizens, the simple story is that 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects. The style and title of your, quote, sovereign people, parentheses, in which you now glory, parentheses, was not then born. You were under the British crown. Your fathers esteemed the English government as the home government, England as the fatherland. Although a considerable distance from your home, impose in the exercise of its parental prerogatives upon its colonial children such restraints, burdens, and limitations as, in its mature judgment, it deemed wise, right, and proper.
But your fathers, who had not adopted the idea of the infallibility of government and the absolute character of its acts, presumed to differ from the home government in respect to the wisdom and justice of some of those burdens and restraints. They went so far as to pronounce the measures of government unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive, and altogether such as ought not to be quietly submitted to. I scarcely need say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Feeling themselves harshly and unjustly treated by the home government, your fathers, like men of honesty and men of spirit, earnestly sought redress. They petitioned and remonstrated. They did so in a decorous, respectful, and loyal manner. This, however, did not answer the purpose. They saw themselves treated with sovereign indifference, coldness, and scorn.
Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers became restive under this treatment. They felt themselves the victims of grievous wrongs, wholly incurable in their colonial capacity. With brave men, there is always a remedy for oppression. Just here, the idea of a total separation of the colonies from the crown was born. It was a startling idea, much more so than we, at this distance of time, regard it. The timid and the prudent of that day were, of course, shocked and alarmed by it. Their opposition to the then dangerous thought was earnest and powerful, but amid all their terror and affrighted vociferations against it, the alarming and revolutionary idea moved on, and the country with it.
On the 2nd of July, 1776, the old Continental Congress, to the dismay of the lovers of ease and the worshippers of property, clothed that dreadful idea with all the authority of national sanction. They did so in the form of a resolution. We seldom hit upon resolutions drawn up in our day whose transparency is at all equal. Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown.
Citizens, your fathers made good that resolution. They succeeded, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history, the very ring bolt in a chain of your yet undeveloped destiny.
Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they standed for, I will unite with you to honor their memory.
They love country better than their own private interests. And all will concede that it is a rare virtue that ought to command respect. He who will intelligently lay down his life for his country is a man whom it is not in human nature to despise. Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country.
They were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but they knew its limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out the more as we contrast it with these degenerate times.
How circumspect, exact, and proportionate were all their movements. How unlike the politicians of an hour. Their statesmanship looked beyond the passing moment and stretched away in strength into the distant future. Fully appreciating the hardship to be encountered, firmly believing in the right of their cause, wisely measuring the terrible odds against them, your fathers, the fathers of this republic, lay the cornerstone of the national superstructure, which has risen and still rises in grandeur around you. Of this fundamental work, this day is the anniversary.
My business, if I have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and His cause is the ever-living now. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. Now is the time, the important time. Your fathers have lived, died, and have done their work, and have done much of it well. You live and must die, and you must do your work. You have no right to enjoy a child's share in the labor of your fathers unless your children are to be blessed by your labors. You have no right to wear out and waste the hard-earned fame of your fathers to cover your indolence.
Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us?
Would to God, both for our sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light and my burden easy and delightful.
But such is not the state of the case. I say, with sad sense of the disparity between us, I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us.
The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought you life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions, whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them.
My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day from the slave's point of view, standing here identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine. I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future.
My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day from the slave's point of view. Standing here, identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine, I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally as hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds himself to the false to the future.
Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity which is outraged, in the name of liberty which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce with all the emphasis I can command everything that serves to excuse. I'll use the serviced language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blindly by prejudice, or who is not at heart a slaveholder, shall not confess to be right and just.
I fancy I hear one of my audience say, "It is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Would your cause would be much more likely to succeed? But I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue?"
Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of laws for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia which, if committed by a black man, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being?
Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding under severe fines and penalties the teaching of the slave to read or to write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. When the dogs in your streets, when the fowls of the air, when the cattle on your hills, when the fish of the sea and the reptiles that crawl shall be unable to distinguish the slave from a brute, then I will argue with you that the slave is a man.
For the present, it is enough to affirm the equal manhood of the Negro race. It is not astonishing that while we are plowing, planting, and reaping, using all kinds of mechanical tools, erecting houses, constructing bridges, building ships, working in metals of brass, iron, copper, silver, and gold, that while we are reading, writing, and ciphering, acting as clerks, merchants, and secretaries, having among us lawyers, doctors, ministers, poets, authors, editors, orators, and teachers, that while we are engaged in all manner of enterprises common to other men, digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding sheep and cattle on the hillside, living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living in families as husbands, wives, and children, and above all, confessing and worshiping the Christian God, and looking hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave, we are called upon to prove that we are men?
Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation, as a matter beset with great difficulty, involving a doubtful application of the principle of justice, hard to be understood? How should I look today in the presence of Americans to show that men have a natural right to freedom? To do so would be to make myself ridiculous and to offer an insult to your understanding. There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him.
What, am I to argue that it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with a lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters? Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employments for my time and strength than such arguments would imply.
What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine, that God did not establish it, that our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There is blasphemy in the thought. That which is inhuman cannot be divine. Who can reason on such a proposition? I cannot. The time for such argument is past.
At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages.
There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity, shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival.
Take the American slave trade, which is especially prosperous just now and carried on in all the large towns and cities in one half of this Confederacy. In several states, this trade is a chief source of wealth. It is called the internal slave trade. In order to divert from it the horror with which the foreign slave trade is contemplated, that trade has long since been denounced by this government as piracy and excellent traffic. To arrest it, this nation keeps a squadron at immense cost on the coast of Africa. Everywhere in this country, it is safe to speak of this foreign slave trade as a most inhuman traffic, opposed alike to the laws of God and man. It is, however, a notable fact that, while so much exaggeration is poured out by Americans upon those engaged in the foreign slave trade, the men engaged in the slave trade between the states pass without condemnation, and their business is deemed honorable.
Behold the practical operation of this internal slave trade, the American slave trade, sustained by American politics and American religion. Here you will see men and women reared like swine for the market. You know what is a swine drover? I will show you a man drover. They inhabit all our southern states. They perambulate the country and crowd the highways of the nation with droves of human stock. You will see one of these human flesh jobbers armed with pistol, whip, and bowie knife, driving a company of 100 men, women, and children from the Potomac to the slave market in New Orleans. These wretched people are to be sold singly or in lots to suit purchasers. They are food for the cotton field and the deadly sugar mill.
Mark the sad procession as it moves wearily along, and the inhuman wretch who drives them. Hear his savage yells and his blood-chilling oaths as he hurries on his affrighted captives. There see the old man, with locks thinned and gray. Cast one glance, if you please, upon that young mother whose shoulders are bare to the scorching sun, her briny tears falling on the brow of the babe in her arms. See, too, that girl of 13, weeping, yes, weeping, as she thinks of the mother from whom she has been torn. The drove moves tardily. Heat and sorrow have nearly consumed their strength. Suddenly you hear a quick snap, like the discharge of a rifle. The fetters clank, and the chain rattles simultaneously. Your ears are saluted with a scream that seems to have torn its way to the center of your soul. The crack you heard was the sound of the slave whip. The scream you heard was from the woman you saw with the babe. Her speed had faltered under the weight of her child and her chains. That gash on her shoulder tells her to move on.
Follow the drove to New Orleans. Attend the auction. See men examined like horses. See the forms of women rudely and brutally exposed to the shocking gaze of American slave buyers. See this drove sold and separated forever. And never forget the deep, sad sobs that arose from that scattered multitude. Tell me, citizens, where under the sun you can witness a spectacle more fiendish and shocking. Yet this is but a glance at the American slave trade as it exists at this moment in the United States.
Fellow citizens, this murderous traffic is today in active operation in this boasted republic. In the solitude of my spirit, I see clouds of dust raised on the highways of the South. I see the bleeding footsteps. I hear the doleful wail of fettered humanity on the way to the slave markets, where the victims are to be sold like horses, sheep, and swine, knocked off to the highest bidder. There I see the tenderness ties ruthlessly broken to gratify the lust, caprice, and rapacity of the buyers and sellers of men.
By an act of the American Congress not yet 2 years old, slavery has been nationalized in its most horrible and revolting form. Mason and Dixon's line has been obliterated. New York has become as Virginia, and the power to hold, hunt, and sell men, women, and children as slaves remains no longer a mere state institution, but is now an institution of the whole United States.
The power is coextensive and the Star-Spangled Banner with the Star-Spangled Banner in American Christianity. Where these go may also go the merciless slave hunter. Where these are, man is not sacred. Here is a bird for the sportsman's gun. By the most foul and fiendish of all human decrees, the liberty and person of every man are put in peril. Your broad Republican domain is hunting ground for men.
Your lawmakers have commanded all good citizens to engage in this hellish sport. Your president, your Secretary of State enforce, as a duty you owe to your free and glorious country and to your God, that you do this accursed thing. Not fewer than 40 Americans have, within the past 2 years, been hunted down and without a moment's warning, hurried away in chains and consigned to slavery and excruciating torture. Some of these have had wives and children dependent upon them for bread. But of this no account was made. The right of the hunter to his prey stands superior to the right of marriage, and to all rights in this republic, the rights of God included.
For black men, there are neither law nor justice, humanity nor religion. The fugitive slave law makes mercy to them a crime and bribes the judge who tries them. An American judge gets $10 for every victim he consigns to slavery, and 5 when he fails to do so. The oath of any two villains is sufficient under this hell-black enactment to send the most pious and exemplary black men into the remorseless jaws of slavery. His own testimony is nothing. He can bring no witness for himself. The minister of American justice is bound by the law to hear but one side, and that side is the side of the oppressor. Let this damning fact be perpetually told. Let it be thundered around the world that in tyrant-killing, king-hating, people-loving, democratic, Christian America, the seats of justice are filled with judges who hold their offices under an open and palpable bribe and are bound, in deciding in the case of a man's liberty, to hear only his accusers.
In glaring violation of justice, in shameless disregard of the forms of administering law, in cunning arrangement to entrap the defenseless, and in diabolical intent, this fugitive slave law stands alone in the annals of tyrannical legislation.
Americans, your Republican politics, not less your Republican religion, are flagrantly inconsistent. You boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, of your pure Christianity, while the whole political power of the nation is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 millions of your countrymen. You hurl anathemas at the crown-headed tyrants of Russia and Austria, and pride yourselves on your democratic institutions, while you yourselves consent to the mere tools and bodyguards of the tyrants of Virginia and Carolina. You invite to your shores fugitives of oppression from abroad, honor them with banquets, greet them with ovations, cheer them, toast them, salute them, protect them, and pour out your money to them like water. But the fugitives of your own land you advertise, hunt, arrest, shoot, and kill.
You discourse equality on the dignity of labor, yet you sustain a system which in its very essence casts a stigma upon labor. You can bear bosom to the storm of British artillery to throw off the 3-penny tax on tea, and yet wring the last hard-earned farthing from the grasp of black laborers of your country. You profess to believe that that of blood.
You're doing so well, sweetie. You profess to believe that of one blood God made all nations of men to dwell on the face of all the earth, and hath commanded all men everywhere to love one another. Yet you notoriously hate and glory in your hatred all men whose skins are not colored like your own. You declare before the world, and are understood by the world to declare, that you, quote, hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end quote. And yet, you hold securely in a bondage which, according to your own Thomas Jefferson, is worse than ages of which your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose a 7th part of the inhabitants of your country.
Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. Be warned, a horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breast of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and fling from you the hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 millions crush and destroy it forever.
Allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope. While drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions, my spirit is cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. Nations do not now stand in the same relation to each other that they did ages ago. No nation can now shut itself up from the surrounding world and trot around in the same old path of its fathers without interference.
The time was when such could be done, but a change has now come over the affairs of mankind. Walled cities and empires have become unfashionable. The arm of commerce has borne away the gates of the strong city, Intelligence is penetrating the darkest corners of the globe. Wind, steam, and lightning are its chartered agents. Oceans no longer divide but link nations together. From Boston to London is now a holiday excursion. Space is comparatively annihilated. Thoughts expressed on one side of the Atlantic are distinctly heard on the other. In the fervent aspirations of William Lloyd Garrison, I say, and let every heart join in saying it, God speed the day when human blood shall cease to flow. In every clime be understood the claims of human brotherhood, and each return for evil good, not blow for blow. That day will come, all feuds to end, and change into a faithful friend each foe.
Wow is absolutely right, Ed. I'm not sure how many of you have had the opportunity to read this. Each time I hear it or I read it, it moves me in very profound ways. Luke, you did a great job reading. I think, honestly, though, the language of Douglas and of the time is language that we right now are unused to and unfamiliar with to a large degree. But there's lots of beauty and poetry and power, I think, in the language of this particular speech. So thank you again for participating in the reading of his speech. If you have the opportunity, I highly encourage you to look at the entirety of the speech. Again, there is power, right, that echoes from the speech hundreds of years later. And as Paul was saying earlier, there is, I think, a profoundness as well as a resonance from the things that Douglas was talking about now, and the implications for us as individuals is real. So the first thing I actually just wanted to ask the group was simply, what came up for you as an individual as you read, as you listened to the speech? What connections were you individually making? And again, I'll just please urge people to try to be as succinct as possible so that as many voices can be heard as well. Okay. Would anybody like to start us off?
I will quickly. This is a very just a historical thing. I think someone said at the beginning of the speech where it was delivered, but it went over my head. Could you tell me where the physical place was? And I have one other question.
Yes, it's Rochester, New York.
Thank you. Thank you. Rochester, New York. Great city. My wife's from Rochester. And the second question, did he give this speech again and again in his travels and history as an orator?
I'll just bring the mic over.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Nick.
I don't know that he gave the specific speech again because it was for that occasion, but the speech was published and widely read. And there's and certainly a lot of the things in his speech were things he was saying in other speeches. But I don't know that he gave that specific speech again.
Yes, Ed.
So I want to know why I can't be a passive anti-racist. I mean, I might be anti-racist, I just don't talk about it. And I think I vote in the right way for the right people and so forth and so on, but that's my question.
Would you like to answer that, or would you like? I was actually going to pose it. So one of the things that I was taught very early on was actually not to answer those questions immediately, but to actually see if, given the wisdom of the group, there might be those who can help answer Ed's question. Luke, you want to give it a shot?
Well, I feel like that earlier on when you were describing a passive racist, you were describing people that think it's not a very big deal and that not much needs to be done about it. And I don't know if this is the same thing that you were intending specifically, but if you are passive, generally that means that you're not taking action, and that that is essentially, supporting not necessarily the cause of racism, but if you're not taking action, then that kind of implies that it's not a very big deal and that not much needs to be done about it. And if you don't take action about something, it's not going to be changed.
I am so happy that we were able to videotape that. That was beautiful.
Building on what Luke just said, if you don't take action against something, that means you're saying it's okay the way it is. However, I think that there are a variety of ways of being active. You mentioned voting. That is an active thing. You are acting in the world. I also think, not letting people get away with saying racist things is something active. If you bring up and say, I'm not comfortable with that, or what do you mean by that? That's another active thing. It doesn't necessarily mean you're in the streets, although that is very important too. Deciding to boycott companies whose policies further things that you disagree with is another form of action. And again, you're not out in the streets or running for office necessarily, but you are doing something in the world. So I think, I want to say that, okay, a lot of us feel like we're being very active when we click on stuff on Facebook and just go like, yeah. But while that's not actually really being active, in a little way it is, because you're doing something in the world maybe that might raise somebody else's consciousness. The temptation, I think, is to be a lazy activist and only click things on Facebook and never do anything else. But voting and speaking and asking questions and voting with your dollars and maybe even running for office yourself or trying to change the policies of companies, those are all forms of action that we can all do in little ways or big ways. So I just want to put that out there, that there are different definitions of active. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Coming to something like this.
Would anybody else like to share, just again, initial thoughts, feelings from having read or heard the speech?
For me, the big deal was him separating himself from being an American. I thought that was really profound. And I don't know that I've ever really heard that before. I mean, I'm sure it's been said before, but I don't know that I've ever really heard it like that before. And I've always felt that way myself in my life, too. I mean, that's really always been my politics. I just don't feel like I'm a part of this, not because I feel rejected by it or something, but I just, I would have to say I'm anti-American, and I've met people from other parts of the world who, are anti-American. And so, that's the political identity that I've always had. And to hear, Frederick Douglass say that so clearly and articulately and thoughtfully, those are your founding fathers. That is your country. That's not mine. It was really quite amazing to feel that kind of identity with Frederick Douglass.
I just wanted to respond to this briefly.
It's something that I hear a lot among African American friends and colleagues, and other white activists and progressives as well. For me, saying anti-American isn't saying it's not the people, it's the policies. It's there's a very different piece in that, and I think Douglass would say the same thing. Yeah.
Here you go, Bob.
My reaction to the speech was, and it reflects to what Paul had said earlier, is that it's a shame that we don't teach this. I taught African American history in the school for 18 years, and after I retired, it wasn't taught anymore. Fortunately, it's going to be taught again. There's a young man who's volunteered to teach the course. This speech should be, in my feeling, that in this community, it would be good if this speech was published right in the other paper. It needs to be read by people of all ilk. So thank you.
Once again, building off this idea of anti-policy, one thing that we as Americans often cherish is our freedom of speech. And thinking back to Frederick Douglass's time, slaves didn't have as much speech or as much power with their words as other people, and I think that is still true today. People's words aren't always heard the same way. For example, if a big company has a certain message such as, I don't know, cats are better than dogs, then if they publish a big story on it, then people are gonna start believing that cats are indeed better than dogs. But if some local coffee shop publishes a different paper on the same subject, that won't get nearly as much traction simply because they don't have the same kind of funding.
And it's important to say that the Supreme, 4 years after Douglas's speech, the Supreme Court ruled, in fact, that people enslaved had no rights under the Constitution, the Dred Scott decision.
I'm going to hop back over. Dale, and then we'll come back to you, Ed.
So I'm wondering, how was this speech, what can you tell us about how this speech was received? You can envision with a big crowd like that, some might have thought he was coming to tell how thankful he was to be free and part of America, and this is obviously not that at all. It's more aggressive, in your face. Here are point by point things that just common sense tells you anyone should be able to see. So I'm interested how it was received both by the people in that area, because they would have known a lot about him, but also in a little wider base.
I'll say one thing very briefly, and we've touched upon this, and Paul, I'm going to ask you in just a moment to talk a little bit more about this. The group that invited him to speak, we've mentioned his work with the women's rights movement, with other people in the Rochester area and internationally as well. I think you're absolutely right. I think it might have come as a shock. I think the challenge for me is that I've also heard some conflicting reports, and I don't know what the definitive answer is as to, again, did all the people in the audience feel one way, or did some people feel, different ways? But I imagine myself often being in that hall at that time without air conditioning and thinking about, again, listening to this man who, by all accounts, was an absolutely, earth-moving orator. Really, in very, very powerful and harsh words at sometimes, speaking truth. And so, it's I don't know exactly the answer, but I just wanted to share that.
I don't have a lot more to add to that. My assumption is that the abolitionists in the audience, and again, there was a range of people of abolitionists where they stood. Certainly, the Garrisonians in the audience would have agreed with him. I imagine they defended some people. There's a professor at Harvard, John Stouffer, who I'd like to connect with to ask him about that. He wrote an excellent book, by the way. It's called Giants. It's about Douglas and Lincoln. It's Parallel Lives. Another book I'd recommend. I will say one thing. Douglas and Garrison split, and Garrison's all through this speech, by the way. And I don't remember. In the longer version, the medium version, there's a line where he says, "I will not equivocate." That's in here. That's Garrison. That was in the first issue of the Liberator. And then Garrison made a comment one time. Someone said, "You're all on fire," and he said, "Well, I have a need to be on fire because there are mountains of ice to be melted." But Garrison and Douglas split over the Constitution, and you see Douglas comes back at the end and feels that Douglas felt that Garrison felt that the Constitution was I forget the quote. You may remember his quote. The Constitution was a pact with the devil, and he burnt the Constitution. And whereas Douglas didn't feel that enslavement wasn't encoded in the Constitution, and they split over that, and it was a pretty serious split for a while.
I just wanted to be mindful of time and start to shift the conversation a little bit in this kind of second half of the afternoon. And the shift for me, I thought, was just to think about, what are the implications for us presently? And it's a large leap, and I acknowledge that as well. But I wonder, again, for individuals, for groups, for communities, again, what do we feel like are the messages, the lessons, the advice that Frederick Douglass would give to us today again, given all of our givens, I'm just curious to see if there are parallels that we can draw out from the speech, again, that might help us navigate the world in which we live in at the moment. Margie?
Well, I'm just going to jump off a little bit of what Luke was talking about in terms of that we all have free speech, but all speech is equal. And I think very much it's that Frederick was trying to be heard. Douglas was trying to be heard. And white voices tend to be heard. They tend to be regarded with greater deference than black voices. And I think we see that today, especially with Black Lives Matter and the people who are speaking in the way that they're treated in the press and the media.
I think one of the things he would discuss is the bondage that black people are in today because of economics. They cannot move forward as well as us white people, given the fact that they're very hard to find jobs and that type of thing, and it holds them back. But economics in this country is not friendly to them.
Yes.
I'm probably not on task exactly, but I'm just wanting to point out that I've just come back from living in the South for 6 years, and it was a total education because, as we have mentioned here, I knew nothing, I realized, as soon as I went south. Furthermore, it was a time for President Obama's reelection, and I landed in the middle of white folks with second homes down there in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And then I went to work for Habitat for Humanity, and that is where all of the black people were trying to get homes. And it was wonderful to live in their world and then to go through OLLI classes, which are for, learning for seniors, and go on the trips and learn about everything in the past that went on. And I was just run over like, a tank had run over me on what to do. You can't say the word Obama down there. You are in the midst of learning everything, and it's like also, well, no, I won't go any further than that, except that I always wanted to do more, but I didn't join any group, and it's just, I should have gone door to door to support Obama, but I realized what a chicken I was, as well as I was also there when Bernie Sanders was running. Mm-hmm. And I've got all kinds of issues going on down there, and I should have been going door to door for Bernie. I mean, I need to join an organization. So if anything else, that's what I've come up with.
Gosh, I just wanted to say one thing briefly is that one of the primary lessons that I learned from the class and that we tried to impart on our students at the end of that experience was that, as Paul already mentioned, the challenge for us as individuals is to think about what are those small, medium, large ways that we want to choose to work. For some people, it may be within their homes, with their families, with their children, their grandchildren, etc. For others, it could be in political organizing. For others, it's education, etc. We believe that each person has a role to play. What that role is, we're not entirely sure, but there is ample work to be done out there. So I'm sure we can help you find what those organizations might be. Here, Betty.
Thank you. Yeah, I was struck by the elegance of this speech, and that how so much of it still holds true today. I mean, the ideas and the principles that we should be living under are stated right here, and his thinking and the way he's used words are just mind-boggling to me. And I was also moved by his description of, I was more moved by this speech in the description of what the slaves went through than I have been in reading other stories. And I just wanted to say that I too lived in Florida for some time. And every year on Martin Luther King Day, the good old boys would drive around in their trucks with the huge Confederate flag waving from the trucks. So, yeah, I would like to be more involved in some organization, some way to help support equality of memberhood in the human race. So, thank you.
Bob, and then we'll come over to Paul.
What I took with regard to your question, Paul, was that I think he would say to us today that we white people have to get active in it. My experience has been that here in Vermont, particularly, we deny that the racism is here, and we have as much going on right in this community as we do as they do in Florida or as they do in South Carolina, and it's very evident. And what I tell people when I give little talks is when they leave, I say the best thing you can do is if you hear a black off-color joke, correct it. And we can't all go out and speak, we can't all write books or do things like that, but we can all do that type of stuff. So that's what I think that Douglas would say to us today if he was speaking.
Yeah, I didn't want this to end before saying that we've just been through the rebel name change. So, we've just had 6 months of absolutely brutal racism and bigotry, and it's just been right out there. And you can read it on the internet or on Facebook, and you can hear it. It's spray painted on the playing field. It's just been horrible, So, there's a perfect snapshot of exactly what even an ultra liberal community like this is like when it comes to racism,
Yeah, building on what you said, I wanted to point out I have a friend who's from North Carolina, and she used to repeatedly bring up to those of us who are friends with her, she's like, look, in the North, we are complacent. And we think that we are not as racist as the South, and we can bring up all these examples of overt racism in the South. But she said in the South, you know where you are. Everybody is openly racist. In the North, everybody hides it. It's behind closed doors. It's not, nobody's riding around with trucks like you said. But it's still there, and it's sometimes more insidious because we take certain things for granted, because our communities are more homogenous, and we're not used to listening to different voices. Or we're not used to having to do so. And I come from Los Angeles, which is a much more diverse city. And again, there's a lot of tensions there, partly because you can't escape them. And some of my students at Champlain will tell me, well, Vermont has no racism. I'm like, really? And, like you said, we've really been looking at and listening to this recently. So I think Frederick Douglass would say to us to not rest on our laurels.
I'll build in part on what Carrie said. I grew up in Georgia, in the Deep South, in the 50s and 60s, at a time when it was going through a great deal of change, and there was a lot of overt racism. And, of course, it's less overt here in New England. But I think the South has changed somewhat, maybe not politically, but I think there has been a greater openness, and we've struggled more here. What I'd like to say is I'm really pleased, and I'd love to learn more about how not only the audience in Rochester on the day of the speech reacted, but how people around the country reacted to it in the years that followed. And draw our attention to the fact that we still have a great deal of racism that's embedded in our educational system, our correctional system, and many others. Lots of opportunities to speak up and act to make change.
I wanted to encourage, we've got about 5 minutes left, at least for the kind of open space here. For those whom have not had the opportunity to share their thoughts yet, I just wanted to make sure that we give that space to those people. Is there anybody right now who has not spoken that would like to speak? All right. I'll continue to encourage those. In my experience, right, these types of settings can, not always work for all people. I will just quickly say and try to talk a little bit about when we close here at 1:30. I'll be able to stay to have an informal conversation with an individual or groups of people. I imagine that others might want to as well. I want to just start to close this space, and I wanted to ask if there were any kind of final words that anybody in the group wanted to leave with the group after having, again, gone through this experience. So, Dale, and then we'll come over to Ed.
Just to add, I think that was an amazing period of time in Rochester and upstate New York, because you had the women's rights going on at the same time. And I think it's important not to lose sight that you could virtually write the same speech. And I'm sure it almost was for Stanton. And this is the 100-year celebration. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind.
I just want to thank you for organizing this and doing it. I teach here at the high school. I had no idea about this speech before today. I will definitely use it with my junior AP students this fall. We read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. This fits right with it. We read Banneker's letter to Jefferson. This fits right with it. And it's, as you say, eloquent for English study, but it's also got a lot of content there that we need to think about. So I think it's just as relevant today, maybe, as it was then, in its own way. Thank you very much.
I was just going to say thanks to Paul and the library for organizing this. It's great to just be able to listen to everybody and think and process and just kind of bring yourself to another level and deeper thinking about issues that matter today.
Do you want to?
Just a couple quick things. I did a little research. Douglass was in jail, but it was while he was still enslaved, and it was because he was teaching other blacks to read and write. So, there's two things I want to say. One is a line that really jumped out to me. Where did it go now? I had it. I lost it. Oh, you boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, and your... I'm sorry? Paragraph number? Oh, paragraph 39. Second sentence. You boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, and your pure Christianity, while the whole political power of the nation is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the same. I often think about how we're a professed Christian nation, and I don't understand who Jesus would deport or deny health care to. We continue, that process continues. And I just want to, a key piece of my work is, I would say over the past 25 years, between classes and workshops, we always start our workshops either through a survey we do or a piece of paper that's handed out asking people in 2 sentences or less to define how they define race and how they define racism. And the vast majority of people, particularly the vast majority of whites, but actually the vast majority of all people, have an understanding of racism as operating on the internal interpersonal dimensions. They might say that racism would be discrimination based on race. And when we're talking about racism, we're talking about something very different. Ism implies an ideology. And when we're talking about racism, we're talking about, the first thing when somebody asks me what racism is, I say it's a system. And it's a system created when one group in our history, whites, particularly white men, to get back to the gender piece, have had the power to systematize and institutionalize our prejudice. So we define racism as racial prejudice plus systemic power. And that's a very different thing. And so in that system, because there's nothing more in this country that impacts me on a daily basis than this, than my skin color. And that in that system, I'm given privilege, and by privilege I just mean simply, privileges are things that some people have that others don't. When I walked into this building today, for example, I didn't have to think about how I was going. If I was in a wheelchair, I'd have to go through this whole calculus of things. Can I get in? Can I use the bathroom? Are there going to be curbs I have to negotiate? As a temporarily able-bodied person, I don't think about any of those things. And sometimes but generally it's not part of my calculus as I go through life. And likewise, as a white person in this country, there are things that I work with an African-American woman, a dear friend Donna Bivens. There are things that Donna faces on a daily basis that I don't have to even think about. And that's what I mean by the fact that I have privileges. And so it's important to understand that race is happening in this room. That I'm assuming, I don't know everybody's identity here, but at least by appearance, other than Paul, we all would be identified as white. And this therefore is highly racialized space. The state of Vermont is highly racialized space, but we don't understand. Race is operating all of the time. And it's, as you mentioned, it's operating in all of our systems. It's operating in the in the education system. Who gets to decide what curriculum gets taught? Who gets to decide what's important? Who gets to determine what intelligence is? Right? Exactly. So I just want us to be aware of that. That we can spend. I can spend a whole semester talking about racism without even having to talk about people of color. And so I just want to come in, and I really thank you for the privilege of being able to join you today. I enjoyed it. And thanks again to Paul.
Thank you very much, Paul. I want to thank everybody formally as well on behalf of the South Burlington Community Library and this town as well. I do want to also say one last thing. Last year we had brainstormed an idea of trying to host more of these types of events. To be honest, there are many speeches that can be given at multiple points throughout any given calendar year that really focus on different kinds of issues. Susan B. Anthony's work, really any number of other speeches as well. But we just thought if the community wants more of these types of events, please get in touch with our local librarians and encourage them to think about how we might be able to host these more often, especially again at other points throughout the year as well. So thank you again. It's been a pleasure. I hope you've enjoyed, and have a great rest of the summer as well.